Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Scenario-Based Development and Testing by Dr. Magdi Hanna. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming PSQT conference in San Diego, California, August 14th through the 19th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel Marina. PSQT is the only conference that focuses on practical best practices in every aspect of software quality assurance and testing. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps a focus on what works. To learn more about this exciting conference, visit psqtconference.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at psqtconference.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magdi Hanna. Dr. Hanna?
Thank you, Eric. All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are, or even good evening for those who are joining us from a very far distance. I'm pleased to spend the next hour with you to share with you what I have been teaching people around the world about how to be proactive and how to prevent defects using the scenario approach. We all know that testing is mostly about finding problems and reporting those problems to the development team to fix it, and we go back and retest and so on. And there is a whole story about why we do not want to do this. We do not want to be simply testers who find problems and report the problems and retest the fixes. I'm sure you all agree that the best approach to go about producing quality systems is when we do something to prevent defects from being in the software from the beginning. And the approach and the method that I'm going to be talking about today, which some of you might have already been exposed to it if you have attended any of my courses at the International Institute for Software Testing, or if you have used the Romana ALM tool, because the Romana ALM tool implements all these ideas. That's why this webinar is also co-sponsored by Romana Software, and you could always go and try that software for free as long as you want it. Let's start with a simple thing here that says, how do we want our requirement to be if we want to have a testable requirement? These are 5 characteristics, as you can see in front of you. I did not invent any one of those. I just put them together, and in my opinion, in order for us to work with the requirement and be able to test based on the requirement, it has to have those 5 characteristics. Okay? Understandable, correct, and I have the definition in front of you here. You can look at the IEEE standard for requirement documentation, and you find nine possible characteristics of a good requirement. But I think those 5 characteristics you see in front of you are a minimal set of characteristics that if a requirement or a user story is missing any one of those, we really cannot test it. Of course, number 2 is the requirement has to be correct. And that means that it has to state exactly what the customer expects. Remember, I'm using the word expectations here. Why? Because there is a big difference between a requirement as written or a user story as written by a product owner in an agile project, or a requirement as written by a business analyst or a requirement engineer. There is a difference between those and the real expectations, what the customer really expects. That's why we always from a testing perspective as well as from a development perspective, we want to always be working on expectations rather than written requirements, because I'm sure many of you know that there is no requirement that's complete. By the way, this webinar came as a follow-up of a post that I had put on LinkedIn about roughly 2 months ago, and the title of the post was "It is about time to stop relying on requirements." And you can go and read that post. Of course, I put there knowing that it is going to cause some argument, some disagreement, but I wanted to get people to start thinking that requirements are never good to use to write code or to do testing. Of course, based on the reaction of people to that post, I followed up with another post which has the same title as this webinar, Scenario-Based Development and Testing. And I elaborated more on the process. All right, and I did promise in my post that I will be doing this free webinar to talk about the process. So with that being said, there are certain things we know about requirement-based testing or even requirement-based development. Okay, all these facts that you see in front of you are known. I'm not making them up. Requirements are always incomplete. I have not seen, as I stated in the post, I said, I have not seen one single requirement, including the requirements that I personally write. I have not seen one that is complete. And of course, some people accused me that maybe I don't know how to write requirements. Well, that is ridiculous. I'm teaching the world how to write requirements, and I'm making that statement that there is no way on earth for any product owner or for any business analyst or requirement engineer or for Magdi Hanna, whoever he is, to write complete requirements. There is no way on earth. So guess what? I will show you in a little bit real data that shows that relying on requirements, as I say at the bottom here, relying on requirements for testing and for development only covers no more than probably half of what needs to be covered. Okay? Or what only 50% of what the customer expects. I will show you the data from actual team projects. All right? Developers tend to make a lot of assumptions because if the user story or the requirement is not complete, guess what? There is a lot of discussions. Certainly discussions are good. And as you probably know, the Agile framework suggests that we should just start with the user story, and we should not be writing too much details in the user story. And really the details about the user story will come up during discussions. Discussions are great if they are documented and if they are done with the full involvement of everybody. Discussions are not good if they just happen between the developer and the business analyst, or between the developer and the product owner. Why? Because there is so much details that come through those discussions that that the test team cannot really know about them. Now, many other developers who actually do not bring anything to the discussion, they tend to make assumptions. You have to believe me in this one. I have seen many developers making assumptions about requirements and writing their code based on those assumptions they have made that they have not shared with anybody. Not only that, they do not know for themselves that they actually made an assumption. So when I look at a code, or when I look at the implementation of a functionality, and I ask the developer, and I say, it looks like he assumed this and this and this, and he or she says yes. Well, if he assumed that, one, why didn't you validate your assumption? It turns out that you are wrong, Mr. Developer. You're totally wrong. You should not have assumed what you assumed. Besides, if you assumed that, why didn't you share this assumption at least with everyone else, especially the tester who is supposed to test? So please, if you have not seen enough of that in your projects, I'm going to have to say that you probably need to pay a little bit more attention. And I'm hoping that I have with me here today some project managers, some test managers who really can keep an eye on those things. Well, I have a solution for you. First, before I give you the solution, I'm going to say this. Typically, as I said, we take requirements, we write test design. That's true about every project. Now, if your project is agile, we take user stories and we write tests. All right? Even if your agile project is doing test-driven development, okay, then your developers possibly are going to take the requirements and write test cases for their unit testing. With the same token, developers always take the requirements and start writing the design and the code. So we're all relying on requirements. And based on the fact that I told you there is no requirement on earth that's complete, almost all requirements are ambiguous, meaning that they have multiple interpretation. Many requirements are full of inconsistencies. I am going to have to say we need to stop doing this completely. And this is really what was my point about it is about time to stop relying on requirements. And of course, a lot of reactions, you can see the reactions on LinkedIn, and you can see how I reacted to those reactions or my responses to those reactions. People did not get the point. People kept arguing that if we're not going to rely on requirements, what do we rely on? Oh, here's what we're going to rely on. This is my simplest picture of the scenario-based development and testing. Again, one more time, I'm certain those of you who attended my 3-day course on best practices in software test planning and the design have seen that, and not only have seen it, but also have practiced on it. Because during that 3-day workshop, people actually use the process and see the value of the process. At the top here, as you can see, we can either have requirements, we can either have user stories. If this is an agile project, the project might be a little bit more disciplined and use use cases. If that's the case, or a project might have used the models such as decision tables or state models or whatever. I really don't care. All those boxes in blue color at the top, they represent forms of requirements. Now, my apology, my throat got dry here. And it doesn't help when I keep sipping on my coffee, so I'll sip water instead. Okay, so in some agile projects, when people look at this picture, they might say, well, no, we don't go from user stories directly, but rather we come up with some what we call acceptance criteria or validation criteria. And I've seen those too. Certainly, I'm going to have to say user stories in agile projects that use also acceptance criteria are much better than user stories that do not have acceptance criteria. But I speak with agile teams and I work with agile teams all the time, and I would say probably no more than 10%, 10 to 15% of all agile projects use acceptance criteria for user stories. But even though people who have worked with user stories that have acceptance criteria for them, when they attended my courses and they have seen this process, they said, and I said, you can replace user story, you can replace acceptance criteria with the concept of scenarios that I'm going to be talking about. They said, no, we're not going to replace it. We're going to keep the acceptance criteria because they provide some more details about the user story, but they don't provide the same level of details that scenarios at the bottom do. Now, so the next step when you have any one of those forms is to go and conduct a collaborative analysis and the review of the requirement or the user story or the use cases or the models. And you start asking questions. Remember, the key point here is collaborative. Collaborative, meaning that we're not going to let developers go and ask the business analyst or the product owner. We are going to have an online collaborative tool that allows everyone to put the question there, and whoever is supposed to answer the question can go ahead and answer the question. Everyone in the team, and that works great whether the team has 5 people or have 20 people. It does not matter. and the tools I'm talking about are what we refer to as collaborative tool or collaboration tool. And the Romana ALM tool, since it implements those functionalities, these concepts, it is actually, it supports this very well. The collaboration management component of Romana does this very well. So what you do here is you find a collaboration tool where you can post a requirement or post a user story. Remember, it's one at a time. You cannot post, I mean, for example, SharePoint is not a good tool for that. Why? Because SharePoint allows you to post a document. I do not want to start with a document. Really the trick about this process is that you do one thing at a time, one requirement at a time, or one user story at a time, or one use case at a time, or maybe one decision table. You put that in the tool and you open the discussion. And the tool has to be what I call a bit invasive, meaning what? Meaning that if I go there and ask a question about any aspect of the user story or the requirement, the tool should trigger an email message that goes to everyone in the team that says, Magdi Hanna just posted a question about this user story. And the reason this works is because people will see that email. They should be able to click somewhere in the email to go back to where that user story or the requirement is posted, and they start also looking at the question that I asked. So now everyone can see the question I asked. All right? And when someone clicks on a button to answer my question, and I really honestly do not care who that someone is, because the question I'm asking could be answered by the product owner, could be answered by one of the developers, could be answered by one of the QA team, could be answered by the test lead or the test manager. Who cares? The person who's supposed to answer, go ahead and click. And when the answer is provided, again, one more time, everyone is supposed to receive an email that says, this person responded to this question. All right, and this keeps going on, and in my process, it doesn't go on more than 24 hours. People are much more motivated to have this discussion online, and they stay in the loop much better than having a review meeting. Forget about those meetings where we do requirement reviews or we do user story reviews. Forget about that. Waste of time. We have an hour to go, and we may not even come up with all the questions during that 1 hour. And people say, you know, I'm sure more questions were going to come later. Again, one more time. I have tried this. It works. So it takes about 24 hours. The good thing is this. During that time, the third box down there, the collaborative scenario development, also takes place. Remember, this is a very iterative process that fits very well with agile and non-agile projects. So as a QA person or as a developer or as anyone else in the team, I can go ahead and start writing my scenarios. I will show you what the scenario looks like in a little bit. I can start writing my scenarios. And while I'm writing scenarios, I might have a question. So I have a question and a scenario, or I have a scenario and a question, or I have a question that's kind of I need to get an answer for before I can finalize my scenario, something like that. In fact, I can go ahead and write 1 or 2 or 3 scenarios down here And suddenly I see someone else is asking a question because I can see the question. Based on the answer to that question, I can now find out that I need to go and add few more scenarios. So the whole thing about asking the questions, getting answers, building scenarios happen at the same time. When I do this with my teams, and my teams, my development team and the QA teams are not, they're scattered all over the world. When I do this, when I put the requirement or the user story out for review, I put a note with it. I says, I'd like to finalize this by tomorrow afternoon, or I'd like to finalize this by whatever, Monday morning. So people know what my timeline is. So people respect that. You have to assume that people are responsible. So people respect that, and they make sure. So this whole thing can take no more than probably easily 24 hours to 48 hours. By that time, we have a number of scenarios that have been written. Not only that they have been written, but they have been seen. So here you go. Here are the kind of things that happen. A QA person would go and write 1 or 2 or 3 scenarios. And of course, one more time, the important point here is that when we write scenarios, the development team and the product owner is supposed to see them. Nothing is done under the table. You can't. When the Agile framework came about, and we saw that the Agile framework promotes and encourages collaboration, I've been waiting to see what kind of collaboration happens in Agile projects. Because I've been teaching that collaboration and stuff more than 15, 20 years ago, before Agile even came about. Okay, the Agile Manifesto came about what, 14 years ago? And I've been always asking the people to collaborate in this process. And then I was pleased to see the Agile framework says, we need to do a lot of collaboration. I said, great. Now I have a framework or a process that would help me implement this. I have not seen that level of collaboration in many Agile projects. Okay, so now, once scenarios are written, everyone else can see it. So a QA person can write a scenario or 2 or 3, put it there. A developer can see the scenarios. A developer could possibly react to those scenarios. And he or she would say, I don't think this is part of the requirement. Why? Because the developer is looking at the original written requirement or the user story. Because the requirement or the user story is not clear enough. So the developer thinks that from his or her point of view that this is not part of the requirement. So now the word becomes for who? For the product owner or for the project manager or whoever is supposed to be running the show. He or she can say, yes, it is part of the scenario or not, part of the requirement or not. That's when we do that, by the way, when we do this discussion about is it part of the requirement or not, or is it part of the user story or not, we're really jumping into this collaborative scenario validation. Now you can see the 3 red boxes happen at the same time. This is simply the scoping of the requirement. You know what I'm saying? So of course, we know that in Agile project, we have to determine the scope of the user story. And I always question, how do we go about determining the scope of the user story? We sit down and say, what is the scope? No. The best way to determine the scope of a user story or a requirement is to start listing scenarios. And in front of each scenario, we have to say, do we believe it is within the scope or not? Or build all the scenarios, and as you're going to see in a little bit, and leave some time to come back for some people to say, well, that is not part of the requirement. And this needs to be confirmed by the product owner or the project manager or whoever. And then if it is determined to be outside the scope, then we just mark it as such. We don't remove it. We keep it somewhere. We're not going to keep it with this requirement because it has been determined it's not the scope, within the scope of this requirement. However, keep in mind, it might not be within the scope of this requirement in this release or in this iteration or sprint, but it might become within the scope in the next release or the next sprint. So in a way, a scenario that has been determined to be not in the scope could potentially in a future release or a future sprint in an agile project could be in the scope. So we need to keep it somewhere. You could keep it within the user story if you want, but of course you have to indicate it as it is not within the scope for this sprint. Okay. So now we move down to the validation of the scenarios, and I'm going to speak in a bit more details about what do we do during validation of scenarios, because my ultimate goal at the end here, I have a number of scenarios for that given requirement or that given user story or the use case. I have a number of scenarios that have been determined to be within the scope and have been validated. And again, as I said, I will tell you what validation means. But once, let's assume that we validated the scenarios. What happens after that? Very simple. The development team now starts working from those scenarios. And they start writing their detailed design, their screen design, they modify their database design, they write code, whatever. At the same time, the test team starts writing the test cases. Okay? Of course, if you work in an agile project and your development team is doing test-driven development, they don't have to write the code directly. They can take those scenarios and they start writing their test cases for unit testing, and they start writing the code based on that. So test-driven development happens here. The picture you're looking at is really what we call acceptance test-driven. Why is it acceptance? Because the development effort is going to be based on those scenarios that are considered to be acceptance criteria. Okay? Now, as I said, the test team, on the other hand, will take those and start writing your test cases. Remember, you can see easily that all the arrows on this chart are bidirectional. I'm sure you know what that means. It means that a developer is writing code or doing design. He or she can start having a question again, and the question was not asked earlier here. So they can go back and ask the question, and the question might lead to another scenario, and the scenario gets approved in the process, and now the developer is doing his or her design or coding based on the revised set of scenarios. Again, one more time, the process must be iterative all the time, very iterative, because as we know, whether we're doing agile or not, you cannot simply finalize things. I'm not going to come here and say, now I have my final set of scenarios. There is no such a thing. But certainly, I do not want to start writing code where I have only 20% of the scenarios that I'm supposed to have. That's why this validation process is very important, because it looks into, the most critical question we ask during validation is that, are we missing any scenarios? Are there any other scenarios that we need to write? So hopefully by the time you move down here or here, you've got more than 80% of the scenarios, and you've asked more than 80% of your questions. Yet, there is still room to go back and add one more scenario. While the quality assurance person or the testing person is writing test cases, you might find out that there is a scenario that has not been addressed. They can go back here, put that scenario. Again, one more time, when I say go back here, I'm talking about going back to the tool. when they put that scenario, the tool has to have an indication to everyone that says, this QA person just added one more scenario. And he or she could do this if they are certain that this scenarios need to be tested. And this scenario needs, in fact, is in the scope. What if they're not sure? What if they come up with an idea? What if the tester says, oh, you know what, I think I need to test a situation where someone is placing an order, assuming that this requirement was about placing an order. Someone is placing an order and paying that order partially with credit that they had with the store. Well, that question never came up. We don't know if it is really within the scope or not. If it is within the scope of this requirement in this release or in this sprint to allow people to pay for an order using partially credits from what they had before. So in that case, he or she can post a question. Simple. Don't make an assumption. Don't make an assumption that it is not within the scope or it is within the scope. You go and put the question, says, are we supposed to allow this and this and that? And if the answer comes back within few hours, yes, then the QA person will go and add the scenario and start writing test cases for that scenario. The nice thing is that the developer have been informed about that scenario and he or she will have to write the code for that scenario. I'm expecting the people with me today to share with me at the end of the presentation or even after the presentation through email. I will put my email online here. To share with me if in fact there is anything that would cause you not to implement this process. Because I have implemented those projects, people find it to be successful. I'm being told by the system that my microphone is loud. Not sure why. I will not shout any further, just for your ears. All right. So what's happening here? Why do you want to do this? Why do I call this more of a defect prevention? I'll tell you why. Because companies that implemented this concept told me that they were able to reduce the number of bug reports by more than 70%. Which bug reports are we referring to? One specific company was referring to the bug reports that were found by the user acceptance team. And as you can imagine, user acceptance is below here after the test design has been written and the test team have run their tests, and then the build or the release was sent to user acceptance to run their user acceptance testing. And why? Why did this company was able to report that they in fact were able to reduce the number of bug reports by more than 70%? I'll tell you why. Because they brought their user acceptance testing team to be part of this collaborative scenario reviews. And that's the best thing you can do. If you have anyone that's available to you who would be judging this functionality or this release or that sprint before going to the customer, or even if you have access to the users themselves, ideally you should involve them here. I'll tell you in a little bit who gets involved in that. Okay. Now, there is another benefit that I've seen happening when people apply this, and that's the level of code coverage and the level of requirement coverage. Now, you probably know, and I'm speaking to the people who are doing agile test-driven development. One of the benefits of test-driven development is that all the code that's been written has been tested. Of course. You know why? Because developers are supposed to write the tests before they write the code. So code is only written because there is a test that will test it. Of course, it's a no-brainer. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. Then every line of code that's being written is being tested. So yes, there are claims that test-driven development will achieve close to 100% code coverage, and I will have to agree. And of course, if you're only writing the code after you write the test for that code, and you're not writing any code for which you don't have a test, because that's the philosophy of test-driven development, then every line of code is going to be tested. But we have a major problem that we have not even thought about, and that is, how do we know? How do we know that those tests that were written by developers are sufficient to test the functionality? Those tests written by developers in test-driven development really are actually the necessary tests, but not the sufficient. So you could, as I always say, with test-driven development, you could in fact put out releases and features that have with the code that has been fully tested, but the functionality has not been fully tested. There is so much that the user expected of that feature that have not even been implemented. Why? Because in test-driven development, we don't take the time to explore possibly, I'm not going to say outside the requirement or outside the user story, but I'm going to say around it. This scenario approach does not only achieve high level of code coverage, but also achieves high level of feature coverage. And that's, to me, what's important. What good does it do for you, if you put out a release or a sprint or an iteration, and all the code works fine, but the customer is trying to do things that they expect it to happen. They expect it to be able to do them, and they cannot do them. Or they do them, and the system crashes. And the system crashes because there was no code to handle it. There was no code to handle it. So the developer did not think of it. So that's why in this process, if we are going to do test-driven development, I want to use the experience of the test team to supplement the effort and the knowledge of the developers in coming up with a set of scenarios. And as we probably know, the more scenarios you can come up with, the more feature coverage you're going to have. To me, a good measure of feature or requirement coverage is how many scenarios do we have. Now, let's move on, because I understand I have about 20 minutes left. So this is a very simple definition of what a scenario is. It's any condition, so please do not attach any definition you might have to a scenario, to the term scenario. I'm using the term scenario to refer to this exact definition. Some people see the word scenario and say, oh, that is a use case, right? That's not a use case. Some people say, oh, it's like use case scenarios. No, it is not use case scenarios. It's this. So don't attach any other definition to this term, because I want the scenario to be no more than one single line. I'll give you an example in a little bit. By the way, all this discussion, all this is part of the courses I teach for IIST, and this methodology, it works great. Scenarios can be normal or abnormal. Things that happen as a normal course of actions, things that happen, but they are not the kind of things that happen all the time. They're not expected to happen, but they do happen. And that's very critical, because when developers write test cases under test-driven development, they don't consider the abnormal scenarios. Okay, so scenario is what? Any situation or condition that could possibly happen in production that the system needs to react to it. So here's a simple example of a scenario. Customer shall be able to place orders online and pay by credit card. This is the requirement. Now, of course, if you're working in an agile project and you use a concept of a user story, then the user story would be phrased as follows. It's going to say, as a customer, I want to be able to place orders online and pay by credit card. So it doesn't matter if it is a requirement or a user story. Okay. So if you have this requirement or user story, here are some examples of scenarios. Things that could possibly happen in production. Someone can place an order for something that we have in inventory, something we don't have in inventory, something, multiple items. Some of them are inventory, some of them are not. To ship somewhere outside, different from the billing address, to ship to a PO box, to ship to an address outside the United States, to use a credit card that's invalid, to pay for the order by credit card that's not acceptable, whatever it is. So you list the scenario. You can see now, the scenario is nothing more than one line that describes the situation or the condition. Keep it simple. The trick here is to keep it simple. Don't elaborate. If you elaborate, then you wasted time writing the scenarios, and you probably are going to be writing multiple scenarios in one scenario. Things get more complicated. I want the scenarios to be written such that a developer, a tester, a product owner, whoever, can go through all the scenarios for what that one single requirement in no more than 15 minutes. So that they can tell if you're missing any scenarios or not. Okay? Please, if you have questions, and I could always go and look for the questions, but keep in mind, if you have questions, that you go ahead, send them. I'm not going to say keep them until the end. Send them now, and I will look at them later on. Okay, so who writes scenarios? I think I told you who can write the scenarios. In my own process, anyone can write scenarios. I don't have restriction. I don't have restriction. Someone says, aren't we have one person who owns the scenario process? Sure. I mean, you can say the QA team is going to own the scenario process. But why do you want to prohibit developers from adding more scenarios? Why do you want to prohibit the product owner or the business analyst from writing a scenario? If writing a scenario is that simple, why doesn't anyone go and write scenarios? As a product owner in some agile projects, I go and look at the scenarios that my QA person wrote. And just in a way, as a way of teaching him or her, I go and add more scenarios, kind of saying, look what you've been missing. I gave you this requirement. You asked enough questions, but you wrote scenarios that are not complete. Here's what you're missing: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I listed 5 scenarios. Any product owner, any business analyst can do that. So because there is a debate out there about who's supposed to write the scenarios. Okay? Some business analysts would say, no, I just write requirements. And some developers would say, well, no, those scenarios are kind of tests. I don't write the tests. No. Those scenarios are, as I say at the top here, they are elaborations on requirements. I meant to put that phrase there to tell you that because they are elaborations on requirements, anyone is entitled to write scenarios. Well, if you are going to be writing a scenario that you are doubting if it is part of the requirement or not, then ask the question. Or put the scenario and in the column that says in the scope of the requirement or not, put a question mark. That's simply saying you're not sure. This is kind of equivalent to saying, correct me if I am wrong. I think it is within the scope, but I am not sure. To give a chance to someone else. So don't fill the column and say, yes, it is within the scope. You see that? Unless you're 100% sure. If you're not sure, put a question mark so people will understand that. And all those questions, all those scenarios that have question marks on that column need to be resolved. Someone, the product owner, the business analyst, whoever, the project manager needs to come back and say, yes, these are within the scope. No, these are not within the scope. All right. So how do we build the scenarios? This is a big process that I'm not sure. So one simple way to do this is through informal requirement analysis, brainstorming, if you will, brainstorming. Or you could use some of those models down there. And I teach you this in much more details in my courses, in my 3-day course on best practices. Okay, so you can build the scenarios based on user interface. In many agile projects, we get screen prototypes. Okay, I can write some scenarios based on the screen prototype. I can also write scenarios based on the user story. So my scenarios would be a combination of scenarios based on the user story, scenarios based on the screen prototypes. I can get the actual user interface working, and now suddenly I start seeing things that I did not see in the prototype and I did not see in the user story, then or in the requirement. Then I can start writing more and more scenarios. So you keep elaborating on scenarios as you go. Decision tables and decision trees are a reasonable way to come up with scenarios. If you work on a very technical systems where you use the state models are a very powerful tool to come up with scenarios. So scenarios are not always brainstorming. They're not like the validation or acceptance criteria for a user story in an agile project. They're not. They can be very, very powerful. So keep that in mind. Because when I teach people how to build scenarios based on decision tables, they build the decision tables and the columns within that decision table are actually the scenarios. Now, are these the only scenarios that has to do with this requirement? No. There are other scenarios that I can come up with based on the requirement that I do not see in the decision table. And certainly the decision table gives me other scenarios that I cannot see in the description of the requirement or the user story. Let's look into the scenario validation process. Who's supposed to be involved? Much more than those who are involved in writing the scenarios. When it comes to validation, you can involve as many roles as you can. As I say here at the bottom, you can involve the user acceptance test team if they're available. In fact, if you have a UAT process, if you know that there is a team that takes this whole thing after it has been tested, and they will run other tests, and the assumption is that user acceptance normally is performed with the user in mind, with the user scenarios in mind. I don't know why I would not bring those people up front. I mean, take my word for it. That will achieve the most when you involve those user acceptance tested teams in the scenario validation process. All what they're doing is providing feedback, and all what they're doing is they're telling us if we are missing any scenarios or not. Not only that, with the scenarios, as we're going to see here in the next step, we're going to put the expected behavior of the scenario down here, because that's important. For every scenario we write, we need to know how do we expect the system to handle it. Of course, if the expected behavior is obvious, then I don't have to write that down. So going back to those scenarios that I showed you, do I need to write the expected behavior of a scenario, of the first scenario, placing an order for something we have in stock or inventory? No, because the expected behavior, remember, expected behavior is not the same as the expected results of a test case. Expected behavior is a much higher level. So we're not talking here about what kind of message the person should see in the screen and things like that. So the expected behavior for this first scenario is something like the order should be placed and the credit card should be charged. Okay, do we need to write that down? That's a default. So normally, in order to kind of keep time, keep things brief, I say if the expected behavior is obvious enough, don't write it down. If the expected behavior is questionable, like for example, placing an order for multiple items, some of them available in inventory, some of them are not. The requirement did not say anything about it. And as someone who wrote this scenario, I don't know how the system is supposed to react to that. So I will write the expected behavior as I think it should be, but I'm not sure. But when it comes to the validation process here, we need to agree. We must agree. All team members, especially product owners, business analysts, developers, and the QA, and even user acceptance testing. Everyone must agree on how the system should handle this scenario. What is the expected behavior? Okay, and we write that down. We make sure that we have negative and positive scenarios, and I define for you here what negative scenarios are. So now we come here to the last step of the process. Trust me, if you follow this process, you're going to come up with many scenarios, much more than what you can ever test. You'll see that probably for a given requirement or user story, you have over 50 or 60 scenarios. And then you have another problem, which is, okay, what am I going to do with this? I don't have time to test all that. That's why we come to the scenario-based risk analysis. And I teach you this as part of the class. So you list all your scenarios, okay? And you start listing those three components. The impact of failure, meaning that if that scenario were to fail, what's the impact? And keep it simple, high, medium, or low. The frequency, how often do we think this scenario is going to happen? Is it every day? Is it 100 times a day? Is it every month? Or is it the kind of scenario that someone will say, I don't know if people would do that. I know they could, but not too many people would do that. So it becomes low. And this one is an interesting one, is that what is the probability of failure? What is the likelihood for this scenario to fail? How do we know? Well, there's a number of things here that could tell us if that scenario could fail. Look at this column here. This column says, is this scenario explicitly stated in the requirement? And this is a very interesting one. Someone say, well, it has to be. No, it doesn't have to be. Because as we said already, the requirement does not list everything and the user story does not list everything. Is it explicitly stated or not? And you'll find that a number of scenarios are not. And I'll show you in actual data right now. I know I have only 7 minutes left, but I have one more thing to show you. There's a number of scenarios that are not explicitly stated in the requirement. So if they are not explicitly stated in the requirement, why are we supposed to test them? Actually, we're supposed to test them because they are part of the requirement. They are within the scope, but the requirement description or the user story description did not spell them out in details. Guess what? Those scenarios that are not explicitly stated in the requirements have the highest probability of failure. You know why? Because developers did not even think about them. If those developers are going by the requirement the way it is written or by the user story, then most likely they did not even write code to handle it. So that's why I immediately put for those kind of scenarios high probability of failure. You see that. Okay. Three characteristics here. Then you simply calculate the testing priority by adding and dividing by 3. If you consider high is 3, medium is 2, and low is 1, so this is 3 plus 2 plus 2, that's 7, divided by 3, it's 2.33. So every scenario has a testing priority. Of course, if you put this in Excel spreadsheet, you can program the Excel spreadsheet such that if you change any one of those, this number will change. And suddenly you have, for a given requirement or a given user story, you have a number of scenarios that are listed with priorities. And you can sort that spreadsheet by priority and you start deciding on which one of those scenarios you're going to test and which one of them you're not going to test. So are there scenarios we are not going to test? Of course. I mean, a scenario like this, 1.33, or a scenario like this, we may not get to it. It's okay. It's listed in the requirement. It's one of those things that if it fails, it's not a big deal. It doesn't happen very often, and we don't have any reason to think that it would fail. It's a plain vanilla scenario. I think if a scenario like this fails, then we have no life. We just have to go and do something else other than building software. Okay. Now, I know, don't get me wrong, please, because some people say, well, I don't want to risk it. You don't want to risk it? Then test all the 40 or 50 scenarios. What else can you do? And remember, I'm giving you a problem to deal with. And the problem now is what? Is you got a lot to test. If you tell me that you don't want to risk it, then don't risk it. Then test everything. But there is another approach. There is actually two other approaches. Let me see what time is now. 5 minutes left. One of them is to, as I always say, to share the responsibility of testing with developers. Wow, what a great idea. What a novel idea by sharing the responsibility of testing between developers and testers. Of course. Well, developers are doing unit testing, aren't they? I hope they are. Especially if developers are doing test-driven development, they must be doing some testing. So that's why I have a column here that says tested by. You see that? Tested by. So we need to put here who's going to test this. As a developer, I have to go in and say, oh, I can test that, I can test this, I can test this. And again, whether I'm doing test-driven development or not, I can test it. If I'm doing test-driven development, then I will write the code to address this scenario and I will test it. This approach kind of makes test-driven development useless, to be honest with you, because now we've got high-level test cases. I'm going to refer to scenarios as high-level test cases. Okay? So a developer can decide, or QA can decide. So that's one approach, to get testers and developers to share the responsibility of testers. If we cannot do this, then we don't have a team. We don't have a team. We have us versus them. And if you have that situation in your project, then very soon you're going to fail. If you have that situation of us versus them. If you have a team, then you share the responsibility. If you don't have a team, and let's assume that we're only talking QA people, and developers, for whatever reason, they don't want to do anything. They just want to write code. And they're not taking responsibility of testing. I have not seen this anywhere, by the way. Then testers, QA people, can start dealing with the problem. They start testing all the ones that have higher priority first, and then for the other ones, they can do them as I call ad hoc testing. I don't have time to explain the difference between formal testing and ad hoc testing, but you can possibly sense what I mean by that. Okay, formal testing is where I take the scenario, I start writing test cases, I formalize my test cases, I write the script, and I automate the script, everything. Now, I'm not going to be doing this for all the scenarios. I'm going to select the low priority scenarios and I will test them ad hoc. Ad hoc means that I'm not going to do anything in terms of documentation. I'll take this scenario right here, whatever it is, and I will go and run a test to test it, just to make sure that it is working without documentation. And I will have a column here, I say pass or fail. Simply saying I tested it and it passed. Or I tested it and it failed. I'm not writing even test cases. I'm taking the scenario. I'm really effectively, when I tested the scenario on the fly, I'm testing only one of the test cases. Okay, so that's why it's informal, it's ad hoc. All right. I'm going to show you just one thing. I wanted to show you this data. I opened that spreadsheet before I started the webinar, just to show you how good the process is. This is this spreadsheet that I have collected the data over time, I think over the last 3 years now, and those are different teams. Okay, these are different teams that use the process. Okay, and here are the number of scenarios that individuals have come. By the way, all those teams, how many teams do I have down here? About, at this point, I have 100 teams, believe it or not. Okay? All these teams work from the same requirement. I wanted to keep things consistent here because it is what I do in that 3-day course on business planning and the design. So teams learn the process, they apply it. So all these teams use the same requirement. A team of 5, here are the number of scenarios that each person came up with individually. Here is the total, but of course there is some overlap between them. So we remove the overlap and we find out the team collectively came up with 26 scenarios. Now, imagine now, if I am this person who came up with 8 scenarios. If I worked it by myself, I would have tested only 8 scenarios. Because I worked with 4 other people, I am now testing, or I now have the opportunity to test 26 scenarios. So how much again do I have? Quite a bit, right? I tripled my requirement coverage or my feature coverage. I tripled my feature coverage. That's why I keep saying, as individuals, we don't test even 20-30%, or I should say, we test no more than 20 to 30% of what we're supposed to test. Our feature or requirement coverage individually is no more than 30%. Now, sometimes it's a good and bad. So this person here, for example, 8 scenarios. With the team, they came up with 32. That's 25%. Look at this person. Now, of course, he's a team member. You can't throw him away. You have to train him. That's 20%. Because 5 scenarios as opposed to 27 by the whole team. This person is performing under 20%. Would you want to have a person testing a requirement and knowing that his requirement coverage is 20%? You know that he's not testing 20% of what he's supposed to test? This is terrible, guys. This is very terrible. We do this every day. Now, here is an important number. Look at this one. Of course, I have here how many positive scenarios, how many negative scenarios, but here, how many scenarios that are not in the requirement. This is the last column that I showed you. And look at the interesting stuff. Some teams found out that, for example, let me look at some of the numbers here. Let's look at this one here. Okay. This team came up with 24 scenarios. All right. 18 of them, 18 of the 24, were not even stated in the requirement. Yet, they have been determined to be within the scope. So they need to be tested. Not only that they need to be tested, developers need to write code for them. If developers did not follow this process, and if developers did not see those scenarios, they will not write code for those 18 scenarios. And that's why I say our coverage now have increased by 300%. And instead of, because remember, 18 out of 24, so they would only write code for 6 scenarios. Now they're writing code for 24 scenarios. I apologize that I cannot go any further. Let me very quick here peek and find how many questions we have down here.
Actually, Dr. Hanna, we don't have any questions at this point.
Okay. All right. If you still have any questions, please go ahead and shoot them to me at my email address. You can you can send me emails with any questions about this webinar or any question about anything, in fact, and I'm happy to respond back. And at this point, I'd like to thank you for being with me today and turn it back to Eric.
Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. This webinar is also co-sponsored by Romana Software, the leader in application lifecycle management technology. For more information about Romana ALM, please visit romanasoftware.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Transform Your Manual Testing Process to Incorporate Test Automation, on August 5th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to psqtconference.com. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Hanna.
Thank you, Eric.